10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 430. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 430 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. Hope you're all doing well out there. It is November, so you know that means that we're going to start a new series. And I've got something really cool for you this month. Something that I've been working on a lot in my practice routine and giving to a lot of my students. And I think this is a really great way to think differently about vocabulary, right? So you might be wondering from the title, prompting. What the hell does that mean? Well, really, it's not that complicated. It is literally just a different way of thinking about practicing your vocabulary. And in this first episode on this particular topic, I want to rant a little bit about some of the problems I see with learning vocabulary. Everybody sort of knows that to some extent, we should be observing, learning, sort of feeling the vocabulary of the masters, right? I've worked on a lot of vocabulary in my life, and I think it's been really good for me. But I think where a big disconnect for a lot of people is they go and they, transcribe some vocabulary, or they lift some from a small portion of a solo, but typically something that a lot of people do is they'll take 2-5-1 licks, right, from their favorite musicians. And then you work on them, whether that be in like one key or all 12 keys or whatever. And then inevitably what happens, this is sort of where it starts to fall apart. This is where I get a lot of questions from my students is like, well, I tried to put it in my solo last night and it didn't come out. Or, I got the first measure and then it like totally fell apart. I can't get it to naturally fit in my solo. I never think of using it. I just spent all this time learning this piece of vocabulary and I never use it. Shouldn't I be using it? Like this kind of talk around learning vocabulary and this kind of difficulty. And maybe some of that resonated with you. Maybe you've had those feelings before. So I do actually have an issue with the piece of advice. Hey, learn some vocabulary and then put that vocabulary in your solos. I think that's kind of a misnomer because now we have all these people out there that are forcibly trying to play vocabulary at their gigs or at their jam sessions or in just a session with your friends, right? So I actually think the correct piece of advice is take this piece of vocabulary that you just learned, put it in your solos in a very measured way in the practice room, but never try to consciously use an entire piece of vocabulary like when you're playing for real. That time when you're playing for real, that should be reserved for literal spontaneous composition, improvisation, okay? And I think when we start to get tied up in trying to insert vocabulary into our real solos, when we're really trying to play and be us, it's like death, for lack of a better term. Because we really shouldn't be thinking about anything, and that requires a lot of thinking and planning and all this kind of stuff, right? So you can take that vocabulary and you can kind of, use it as a centerpiece for what you're working on in the practice room, right? When you're improvising in the practice room with limits, right? That's called practice. And constraints, that's what practicing is. That's fine with me, okay? But just don't take it outside of the practice room. And you can disagree with me on that. That's totally fine. But that's just my opinion. All the benefits you get from learning vocabulary, working with it in the practice room, and then when you step outside of the practice room, forgetting about it, you're still gaining so many of the benefits. We do not need to see this one-to-one. Well, I worked on a really cool 2-5-1 lick. So therefore, all of my 2-5-1 playing at the gig tonight needs to be ultra hip and needs to have elements of that line. It doesn't work that way. It's not a one-to-one relationship. Okay. You might work on something in January, and then you find that it actually doesn't come out in your playing until, July. That's fine. And the more we realize that, the better off we'll be. Okay, so that's the end of my rant on what I think the problems of traditional vocabulary in the instruction, learn this and stick it in your solo. That's where the real problem lies. So now let's go into prompting, all right? And basically this is just using vocabulary as a launching point in the practice room to spur new ideas or take you in new directions. But the difference between this and just like stealing a piece of vocabulary that you really, really love is that we're going to do it in strategic places. So we're going to use the blues this month, and we might continue this with another tune into next month to really drive this point home. But we're going to use the blues. And what we're going to do is we are going to prompt our playing by playing something pre-planned in a specific part of the form. So this week, we're going to talk about the first bar. We're going to play something that we've already written. We're going to play a variety of things that we've already written in the first bar. And what this is meant to do is it's meant to set the actual tone for what we play next. So we want it to lead us somewhere that we may not have gone before if we were left to our own devices. We want to use the prompt as sort of this like artificial device to send us in a direction or get a certain sound into our ears, get a certain rhythm into our ears, get a certain voice leading principle into our playing. And then all of a sudden, we might actually start to use that voice leading principle on our own without being prompted. But I think you need to be prompted at the beginning to do some things that might be unnatural for you, that if you are prompted to do them enough times, suddenly become pretty natural for you. All right, so let's dive into the examples from this week. So the first prompt is over the first bar of Concert B-flat blues. And what I want you to play is this. Okay. Would you ever play that on your own without being prompted? Well, I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But can't you agree that the things that you have to play after that probably should be related to that? Or at the very least, they should make sense coming after that little simple scalar line. Sorry. Wow. That was a fail on my language skills. You're landing on the third of the 4 chord in measure 2. Do you ever do that? Well, if you don't, I guarantee you that sort of being prompted into that is going to lead you to some new material. Like, wow, I never land on that third. Cool. Now I got to develop some material that can go from the third. All right. Well, what about the second prompt? The second prompt sounds like this. So that one lands on the 7th. It has a slightly different rhythm. It has a different direction. Obviously, it's descending instead of ascending. And you have a completely different set of things that are going to sound good after that, right? So that's going to be on you to come up with some stuff that sounds like the logical and musical thing to play after that. And we've got our third prompt here. And that one sort of completes the notes that are fun to resolve to in bar 2 with the 5th. So what are you going to play after that? Right? So all of that, whether I was conscious of it or not, the rest of the chorus was actually inspired by what happened in that first measure. And that's the whole goal here, is just to give you some new inspiration that might spur some new ideas to come out of your instrument. And you don't have to limit yourself to just the stuff that I've given you. You could go into a million different of your favorite blues solos and just steal what the artist plays over the first bar. Use that as your prompt. And in this way, we have a never-ending well of material to draw on, but we're not relying on it as heavily. What we're doing is we're using it as a lead-in to our own creativity. And I think that's the most effective and efficient form of practicing, right? Take a really, really, really small portion of what somebody you love has done and then rely on yourself. Because at the end of the day, when you're out there playing, you want to not have to think. And the only way you're not going to have to think is if you rely on yourself. So start relying on yourself in the practice room. So I think this will be a really, really fun exercise for everybody. For the Patreon members, I'm going to give you a backing track. I'm going to give you the PDF of the prompts. And then I'm going to give you a few trading tracks where we can go back and forth playing off of that prompt. I'll play the prompt, play a chorus, then you play the prompt, play a chorus, and then we'll kind of move through all those different things together. So that's what this month is going to be all about. And we're going to put some of these prompts into like what could be kind of weird places for you to have to like sort of insert something. And remember, do not use these prompts when you're out at your gig. Please don't try to remember them. Have faith in the work that you're doing in the practice room. And then when you step on stage or you're playing with your friends or you're in a situation where you're really trying to improvise, just do it. Turn off the brain and improvise. Okay. That's sort of my word of caution when you work on this stuff. Okay, but have fun with it. Now, if you're new to the show, you heard me mention Patreon, and that's the way that we support ourselves with this show. We don't do any advertisements or anything like that on this show. Instead, the way that we keep the lights on is by relying on our listeners to support us in the form of a small monthly donation. And in return for that donation, you get all the materials from every single episode. So if you want to know more about that and you want to grab these prompts and start working on them, have a nice backing track, all that good stuff, go to 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or go to patreon.com and you could search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. You'll get all the information. You could sign up. And as soon as you sign up, you get instant access to not only this episode, but every single episode we've ever done, which is quite a few at this point. So again, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or patreon.com, search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. Quick shout out to some new patrons this week. Thank you to Lewis, Elliot, and Florian. Thank you guys so much for joining up to be a part of the family. I think we've got almost 400 people over there supporting us. So thank you to you all. You're the reason that the show keeps coming out. All right, have fun with this stuff, and we'll see you next week with another prompt in another place in the blues. Bye, everybody.